and the vast majority would have been involved in violence themselves. We actually interviewed them from the range of different paramilitary groups right across the sectarian divide and asked them why they got involved in violence, what was it like being a combatant, being in prison, and then what was it like afterwards. And what came across actually was very few were ideologically motivated. Especially young people that got involved. They got involved because of the situation they were in. So if something happened to a family member or a peer group member, they got involved because it was the thing to do. And invariably, virtually all of them from both sides of the divide said they got involved to defend their community. So it was the circumstances that they were in. And very often, if not only the circumstances, but the politicians' speeches that created the circumstances that they joined, although those politicians would be the first to say that they weren't involved in violence. So to try and draw out draw out the understanding of how people got involved. And similarly with the victims of violence, we worked with them, people that have been bereaved or injured. And it was sabotage. And essentially what it was with them was what really annoyed them was when people talked about statistics. There were X thousand people bereaved or injured, whatever. And they would say, my son or daughter is not a figure. So again, what we did there is we funded some projects of self-help groups for victims. And we had a project modelling the AIDS quilt in America, where different people made a patchwork quilt, which summarised the life of their loved one. And some of the victims' families, they might have used the materials from a wedding dress for a daughter that was killed, or a football shirt or something, and they made the quilt, but then they sewed it together. It wasn't the quilt, it was the fact that they actually could talk about the experience that they'd gone through in terms of creating that empathy, and talk across the sectarian divide. So whether it was the mother of a British soldier that was shot, or the wife of an IRA man. So again, it was trying to get underneath the sort of, whenever a feeling and emotion gets hardened by a political framework, to get underneath that and then create the empathy that could allow, and has allowed in our case, victims to actually talk to an ex-prisoner that might have pulled the trigger who shot their loved one. And it does take a lot of work, but actually what we found was that a lot of the victims actually wanted to find out why it was that this happened. Most of them, not all, because we obviously have a spectrum of people, they actually weren't looking to see somebody in jail or in court. They just wanted the story of why it happened. So empathy, and if those sort of stories could be got out, and there's nothing more effective, rather than talking about concepts like tolerance, there is nothing more effective than actually perhaps interviewing some of those most directly affected. A member of the Copt religion whose church has been burnt down. What does that mean for that person? Because then at least people can have some sense of relating to it, as I say, rather than talking in concepts. To be honest, we weren't particularly successful in having much impact with the media. We did try some alternative media approaches, like local community DVDs that were shared between different single identity communities, community radio. Community radio actually was probably more open to use than the television, which was more tightly controlled.
Some of you are leaving for classes, but we could take, I think, one more round of questions. If not, I'll ask mine, because you touched on this, but I'd love to hear more about it. We have a lot of problems here with torture. It's taking place in police stations, it was taking place inside some of the demonstrations, the use of harassment to keep people away. How did you deal with state violence and state torture?
The first thing that's with torture or harassment is documentation. And we actually trained local people to document what was taking place, but it was not documented. It will either sort of become invisible, and the danger of becoming visible at one level is that nothing will be done about it. But the second danger about it becoming officially invisible is that it then becomes mythologized and actually almost becomes greater than it is, and becomes a reason for a new generation of young people to get involved in violence, because they say that's the only way forward. We also had very important NGOs, civil society organisations, that took that local documentation and published reports that drew out trends. And we then used the international arena. We lobbied at United Nations level and European Court of Justice, and wherever we could highlight the issues to show that there was a relationship between what the local people were saying and international commentary. And indeed, a number of cases against the British government went to the European Court of Human Rights, which was actually, when we saw the photographs from the Abu Ghraib prison in Afghanistan, it was the exact thing that we had gone through in 1972. Absolutely the exact same. Haven't they learned anything? And that's the other reason why you have to document torture and cannot, whoever has been tortured, whichever it's your side, the other side, whoever. Because if something isn't done about it, then it will just be replicated and repeated.
Any final? Yes.
Thank you again. Two questions. One, about the generalized sentiment of tolerance and reconciliation as you move across the board from ethnic to gender to other types of tolerance. In your experience, has it been a generalized, those who are tolerant in one area tend to be tolerant in other areas, or is that specific, area specific? My second question is, in North America, did you have to go through a rehabilitation of not only victims, but also of torturers, police officers, security men, soldiers? Thank you.
On the tolerance one, we didn't necessarily find a read across. People were more likely to look at tolerance and reconciliation in terms of the politics, and to an extent religion. Our churches actually weren't that good. I mean, they kept their heads down during the Troubles. They would make the odd rhetorical call for peace. But to be actually effective, churches need to relate those top calls for peace down to the parish level. That's happening at the moment in the Central African Republic quite effectively, and it happened in places like Guatemala to an extent. It didn't happen with us, and what we didn't find is a church tolerance of gender issues. So it was varied. The rehabilitation of torturers and police officers, to an extent we haven't had that. Now what we did do is we stood down our police and actually had a complete reform of the police service. So we went from a police force to a police service, and we changed the whole composition, or a large proportion of the composition of the police. And we have very hard and fast external accountability structures for the police. There's an ombudsperson that people can complain to. There's policing boards made up of all political parties and civil society that has oversight of the police. So that was very important. One of the reasons I think that we didn't go so far
time in the future, and therefore I need to get them out of power. I need to change the power structures now before they can do that, like preemptively. How do you build trust past that? And I mean, because, there's a temptation, because you have gotten to a point where you're at sort of a neutral stalemate and things look peaceful in Northern Ireland, to say, well, they must have been at a different point in the beginning. And much of what you said sounded like you were talking about where to go when you're already at point D, whereas I feel like we're at point A -3, and how to get to that very, very, very early step of where people are even willing to think about the other side sharing power at all.
I think, first of all, you need to sort of work around two things, irrespective of what political systems that you end up with. You need to have some level, or try and work towards, some level of principled political culture linked to citizenship. So that, you know, if my side's out tomorrow, at least I have the framework protection. Now you then need to work to implement it, because you can have a framework that everybody ignores. But a principled sort of sense of citizenship, and I say the Women's Coalition, when we set it up, we use the three principles that relate back to my values of the need for inclusion, the need for human rights, the need for equality. In terms of actually, you know, in the middle of conflict, how do you start, if you like, making contacts, if not building trust? First of all, you don't go in on the hard politics, I think, because that's where you hit the gatekeepers. But you start looking at almost how do you flow around the blocks that divide us. And we would have done it a lot by looking at, say, social and economic conditions. You know, so that there's a reason for people to come together, because actually there might be a win-win situation on doing something around housing, or doing something around sewerage or water or something like that. And that gives people a reason to come together from across political divides that they can justify to the gatekeepers and the power holders. To say, well, we're doing it to get something for our community. But then over time, that starts to break down stereotypes. Doesn't eliminate, you know, political differences, but at least it allows some level of communication in a situation where people can debrief each other on why did that happen. Because if they can't do that outside their power holders, then everything is filtered through very narrow political frames whose interest sometimes it is to keep people apart. Because that's the way that they're looking to get back power. And we used women's groups a lot for that, locally based women's groups. And we actually had a network. We had a lot of women's groups in these single identity communities. They were either wholly Catholic, wholly Protestant. But we had a network that was established since 1981, whereby we initially brought those groups together the last Friday of every month, without fail, no matter what the last atrocity was. We kept bringing them together, no matter who turned up, just to pay for buses to bring people in. We brought them first to a neutral area, but then after that they decided themselves to rotate their meetings between first a Catholic community, then a Protestant community, then a Catholic community, then a Protestant community. So again, they were actually going beyond the peace walls, going beyond the power holders, to actually see what it was like from somebody else's side. Because if we didn't do that, what we found was each side saw themselves as the most oppressed, most victimised, most intimidated against, and most conspired against. And actually, you know, when you got down to those sort of issues, people were probably experiencing the same sort of everyday living conditions. And then you sort of work backwards up to look at the political options. You know, and then you brought in, you know, ideas, whether it was about power sharing or whatever else, to actually sort of, to try and refocus the discussion. And then the other thing we did, as I mentioned, was we brought in speakers from other divided societies who sort of said, well, okay, you know, what we did was we changed the electoral system, or we did that, that, and people were prepared to look at, say, what the South Africans have done, rather than perhaps more locally.
I have one quick question. Were you all, the people who were working to try to build peace, were you all facing torture and arrest and things like that for the activities that you were doing just trying to build peace?
Personally, I didn't, though I was blown up. Things like that. I don't think it was personal. It's just everything's been blown up. In fact, I was just saying earlier, it was a period in Northern Ireland, just coming up to Christmas, when we had a bombing campaign. The big war mural went up about this time of the year, saying "Shop now while shops last" for Christmas. But many of those involved in peace were. And in fact, I would argue that now, certainly, and actually even before the ceasefires, the people that swung that ceasefire were the ex-political prisoners, and the people that were still in prison. They were the ones that actually reflected on the fact that saying, look, this isn't really going anywhere. You know, we're all going to fight ourselves to death. So we really need to look for alternatives. And we always called the prison, because we had so many political prisoners, you know, as the political university. Because the politicians on the outside were afraid to take risks because they were going to be doorstepped by the media and whoever else saying, oh, you're doing this, and what does so-and-so think, or whatever else. But the prisoners on the inside could, because they didn't have the same sort of obvious constituency. And a lot of the movement came from that quarter.
Thank you.
Avila, you have embodied for us hope today, I think. You've reminded us that peace doesn't happen because armies and politicians and presidents make it happen. It happens because ordinary people take those steps. It takes a lot of courage. You've reminded us it's hard work. It's not going to just happen. But that there are really concrete, relatively easy things that some of us could begin to do step by step. Also, I know because we went around with Avila yesterday meeting youth groups in Cairo that are committing themselves to taking these steps, that there are ways that we at AUC could get involved and we could start to make a difference. And I think Avila could be available for the next 5 or 10 minutes if you wanted to speak more with her. Come to us at the Gerhardt Center if you'd like to know how to get more involved in some of these ideas and moving Egypt forward. I hope in 20 years we can be as hopeful about our society as you have made us about yours. Thank you once again.